Hey guys, James from SIKKY Manufacturing. Today I'm going to show you a step-by-step installation guide on how to utilize our transmission adapter kit to mount this 6-speed Nissan transmission to your Gen 3, Gen 4 small block LS engine. This SIKKY adapter system was designed to be universal, which means you can use it on any chassis. We offer two different adapter systems currently, one for the older transmissions and one for the newer. Today on this installation guide, I'm going to show you how to install both of our adapter systems, which are very similar with the exception to some of the hardware and where you have to clearance the bell housing. But we'll go over both of them during this installation guide. This adapter kit system comes with everything you're going to need for the installation, with the exception of your clutch disc and pressure plate, as well as your pilot bearing. For your clutch disc and pressure plate, you can use any Nissan or aftermarket Nissan upgrade clutch and pressure plate, as well as it's designed to use the factory Nissan pilot bearing or anything that's designed to fit in a factory Nissan application. Our adapter system allows you to use factory Nissan pilot bearings to make it real easy down the road if you should have to do some maintenance or upgrades. Alright, so the very first step in this installation is we need to remove this casting lug that's located right where the starter mounts. So this can be left on there, but it makes it really hard to get the starter on and off, so it's not needed for anything, so we recommend cutting it off. You can either use a cut-off wheel or a Sawzall makes quick work of it as well. Alright, so next step, you're going to want to make sure your LS has these two big dowel pins on it. If it doesn't, stop the installation right there. Make sure you go buy them. They're pretty simple to get, only a couple dollars. They're extremely crucial for locating this plate. Is a precise placement, and everything afterwards is affected if this plate's not aligned on these dowel pins. So you're going to take your SIKKY adapter plate and put it up on the actual motor. And make sure it slides onto those dowel pins nice and snug. There's no rock, no wobble. So you're going to take these three low profile M10 by 1.5 inch long bolts and install these guys. In the countersunk holes. Now you're going to use a 7mm drive Allen socket to get these in, or an Allen wrench depending on what you have. Next, you're going to take the two M10 by 1.5 hex head, flanged hex head bolts and install in these upper corners as shown. You're going to use a 15mm socket to tighten these down. At this stage, it's best to press in the SIKKY pilot bearing adapter. Now you want to make sure, if this is a used engine, that you thoroughly clean this area out. Make sure there's no burrs or issues with this or rust. So you have like a Scotch-Brite pad or something, get in there, clean it with some brake clean. Make sure that's really, really clean. The other thing you want to do is put this in the freezer. It's going to make the installation a lot easier. Cold shrinks it up a little bit, allows it to slide in a little bit better. You're going to want to start it by hand and start tapping it lightly, and then you can use either a driver or even a socket and a hammer. I'm not going to install this because this engine's not going to end up with that at the end, and it's going to be a little bit difficult to get this guy out, but for all intents and purposes, you're going to drive this in just like you would install a pilot bearing in any crankshaft. And keep in mind, after you install this into the crank, then you're going to take your Nissan pilot bearing and press it into this inner diameter hole here. So pretty simple installation. It should be just like putting a Nissan pilot bearing in once you get to that stage. If you're going to drive it in until it stops, it's going to essentially be flush with the front side of this crank edge here. At the moment, this kit comes with the adapter plate that we machine already bolted to the starter. So at some point in the future, if you're watching this video, this plate might need to be installed, but it's pretty simple. There's 3 Allen bolts that get installed to adapt it to this adapter plate, which then bolts to the main adapter plate. At this point, we're going to move on to installing the starter to the SIKKY adapter plate. This is going to be done using the two 3/8/16 3/4 inch long Allen bolts that are provided in the kit. This is going to be a 5/16 Allen. Now for this upper one, a regular size Allen wrench will work. You just have to let the starter hang back like that. Or you can get a stubby Allen wrench like I've got here. And it makes the installation a little bit easier. It's a tight fit, so just use whatever tools you have available. Make sure they're snug, you're good to go. All right, so next step, we're gonna get this flywheel installed. Now, with any aluminum fly, you always wanna use a bolt plate, so the SIKKY kit comes with this. This basically ensures that the bolts get torqued properly, and we highly recommend using the ARP bolt set. There's a specific bolt set for this flywheel with a bolt plate, so it's part number 244-2902. These are available at the time of checkout when you're buying the adapter kit, or you can buy them from your own source. So again, 244-2902 is the part number we recommend, and you're going to use ARP's torque specs. Again, you just want to make sure that surface is clean. This is a crate motor, so we don't have to worry about that. All right, so you're going to need to use a 3/4 inch 12-point socket to install the ARP bolts, and obviously the SIKKY bolt plate. But one thing to make sure you do, you want to put some sealant on the end of this bolt, because if you don't do that, you could get some oil leaks through the actual crankshaft since it goes into the crankcase. And also, you want to make sure you use the ARP fastener assembly lubricant, or Ultra Torque, which helps make sure that these bolts torque to the proper spec following their guidelines. So we're going to get them all in your finger tight. Note, this is coming back off. This is just for installation purposes, so I'm not actually applying the sealant or the lubricant to these bolts, because this is just for show. Just don't get that confused. But we're gonna get all these started in here finger tight. All right, so you always, with something like this, you're gonna do a crisscross pattern. Use this to snug them up real quick. Not really applying any torque. So first step with a torque wrench, you're gonna wanna do 15 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern, then 36 foot-pounds, and last but not least, 74 foot-pounds, and just keep alternating. So this side, this side, this side, this side, this side, this side, and so on. So again, we're not gonna do all the torquing on this because this flywheel is coming back off, but just to show you how it goes on there. All right, so next step would be to install the clutch and pressure plate. But before that, we gotta get these dowel pins that come in your hardware kit. So these actually locate the pressure plate on the flywheel. So they have a tapered end on one end and then a more flush end on that. So that flat side goes into the flywheel and the tapered end goes out for the actual pressure plate. So there's 3 of them on here. You obviously want to wipe this down with some kind of solvent like brake clean or something to make sure there's no oils or anything on here. Then you're going to take your clutch and pressure plate, install it as you normally would. Torque specs for the pressure plate are going to follow your factory specifications for the most part, but general rule of thumb is going to be a crisscross pattern, much like the flywheel bolts. It's going to be 7 pounds typically, then 18, then 30. Pretty basic install on that. We're going to skip over the clutch and pressure plate install because that's all coming back apart, and that's basic installation, so we're not going to show that part, but we're going to move on to the next step. All right, so up to this point, this installation has been the same regardless if you have like a DE, a 350Z older transmission, or the HR, JK, newer 6-speed transmission. But this is where the directions will kind of have 2 different options. So depending on which you're using, we're going to install the dowel pins, and they're going to go in different positions for each different bell housing. So the older transmissions out of your like DE, non-HR, Z, or G are going to go in the bottom holes like this. So these pins that come with your hardware kit simply slide into the bottom holes, and that's set up for DE. If you're running an HR trans, you're going to run it in the upper holes. Same thing, slide them in. One thing to note from all of our testing and looking into these kits before we design our own is these dowel pins are extremely crucial, and pretty much all the ones that are the adapter kits that are on the market right now had really bad dowel pin fitment. And a lot of people might be like, oh, whatever, that doesn't matter. But That's probably one of the most important things, that and these bigger dowel pins, which we spent a lot of time with CAD and the design making sure ours are absolutely spot on. And what that means is the alignment from your input shaft, your transmission, in relation to this pilot bearing has to be perfect. And when those dowel pins aren't perfect, you run into all kinds of issues where you get unwanted side load on that input shaft of the transmission. So you're constantly like trying to bend that input shaft. And what that'll do is basically take a perfectly reliable transmission and make it fail prematurely. So, you know, one thing to note with ours is, you know, that placement is 100% spot on. It's something you should consider when you're shopping around, because there is several options for these plates and adapter systems that are out there. But if you go with the SIKKY one, rest assured you've got perfect dowel pin placement and you won't be doing any damage to your transmission. All right, so the next step is also going to differ based on which transmission you're running. Again, this kit's designed to work with both, but they are sold separately because of these minor differences, and most of that's just hardware related. But the bell housing on both transmissions needs to have some clearance added, and that's going to be the same from any manufacturer out there, and that has to do with the diameter of this starter ring gear that's on the outside of the flywheel. On the older DE transmissions, I'm going to show you that first, I have a bell housing cutaway just to make it easier for you to see the differences. So you can see there's this little bump on the inside of the transmission, and that's essentially there for clearance on the slave cylinder that comes on the older DE non-HR transmissions, where the slave cylinder normally mounts here and actuates the pivot arm that goes into the actual throw-up bearing. But because of this indent here, the inside will contact the flywheel if you don't do anything about it. So really quick and easy. This particular example was overcut, but I'll show you in a sec. It's a minor trim or flattening of it. So you've got a grinder wheel. You could use a Sawzall to do it. You're going to get in here and you're going to take off like roughly 1/8 of an inch off of this bump. So you're not cutting all the way through it. You're not opening any hole up to the outside, but you're going to knock this bump down. And if you go back about 1 inch from the end of the bump, it'll give you more than enough clearance. That'll leave you about 1/8 of an inch clearance to the flywheel ring gear itself. So, but I'll throw this on here real quick so you can see what the clearance looks like from the inside. Now, it's not easy to see, but you can see in there that currently there's about 1/16 of an inch between the bell housing and the flywheel teeth, as well as probably almost 1/4 inch of clearance between the back side of that clearance area. So you could, you know, like I said, 1 inch will give you more than enough room. You could probably do less than that, but pretty simple, quick modification. That's the only bell housing modification needed for the older CD009 or DE version of the transmission. And then I'll show you the HR modification next. The difference on the older transmission versus newer one is the old trans, or your DE trans, requires clearance on the starter ring gear that runs around the outside of the flywheel, whereas on the newer trans it's coming out of your HRs, 370Zs, you know, commonly referred to as a JK transmission. It actually needs clearance for the starter gear itself that pops out of the starter and engages in the flywheel. So one of the advantages of going with a SIKKY kit is we actually provide this 3D printed template, which is really awesome. It contours to the bell housing, locates on a reinforcement rib that's in the bell housing. So it has absolutely perfect alignment and shows you exactly where you need to cut out that little hole for clearance on a starter gear. This is kind of a big deal because the last thing you want to do is, you know, have like a inaccurate measurement you're going off of to kind of guess where that little window needs to be cut. Lo and behold, you get the transmission up in there and, you know, find that the starter gear is still hitting. It's going to be a lot of extra work to pull that trans back out and modify it. So rest assured, using this template, you're going to get perfect cutout every time for that clearance, and just enough where you're not cutting more than you need to. So really handy little tool that allows you to mark the transmission where you need to cut it. Then you can come in using either like a Sawzall or a cutoff wheel or something, whatever you have handy, even a hacksaw if you've got some really old school hand tools. But basically going to come in here and cut the bottom line, the top line, or vice versa, and then You can either score this or, you know, grab it with a pair of pliers and kind of work it back and forth a little bit, and it'll snap off back at the back end of both of your lines. So we're going to put this on here now and come in here and score it. You can either scratch with like a screwdriver or an awl, or use a Sharpie depending on what you have. But I'm going to take a screwdriver here and hold it in tight so it's not moving around, and just make some marks. And you can pull the template off. You can clearly see your lines and know exactly where you need to cut. So I'm going to use the Sawzall method. There's no right or wrong way to do it, whatever gets it done. Just take your time, make sure your cuts are good. All right, so we got the two cross cuts in here. Like I said, it'd be great to score this a little bit. That way you just know it's going to cut clean right across there or break off. You don't necessarily even have to cut this, because unless you got a really small cutoff wheel, you're going to overlap into bell housing you don't necessarily want to cut. So you can do a couple different things. You could probably score it with a chisel and it would get you the same result. So, but we're going to snap this piece off with a pair of pliers and keep moving. All right, so at this point in the installation, you're ready to install your transmission. Keep in mind that the pressure plate and clutch are already installed. Again, we're not doing it on this particular install because we're gonna take it all back apart, and it's pretty self-explanatory. So we're gonna go ahead and do the DE or the older Z or G transmission installation first. Again, the install is a little bit different between the two, the newer and the older transmissions, because of the hardware mainly and some of the bolt locations. So we'll go over the DE or the older 350Z transmission at this point. So basically, older transmission, you're going to run the dowel pins in the lower hole. You're going to take your bell housing or your whole transmission, I should say, and slide it onto the dowel pins. Again, it's nice and snug. There's no rock. Everything's perfectly tight. Flywheel's got clearance because of our previous step. So you're going to take the 5 M12 by 175 bolts provided in your kit, and we're going to start installing them. Just get them all in here finger tight first. And there's 4 located along the top. And then you've got the 5th one is all the way over here on the side. So we got all 5 of them installed and finger tight. All right, so now we're going to take the 2 remaining M10 by 1.5 30 millimeter long bolts that 4 come in the kit for the DE, and we're going to install them on either side. Same thing, just get them finger tight for now. All right, so next step, we're going to take the 2 M8 by 125 bolts that are provided. And if you notice, the DE bell housing actually has threads in it, but these bolts need to get installed from this side, so we're not actually utilizing the threads that are in the bell housing hole. They're going through and into the SIKKY adapter plate. So just slide them in, and same deal, finger tight. Now, one thing to note, if you're running a SIKKY oil pan or even an OEM LS oil pan, our plate does provide these lower holes that tie it into your oil pan. This pan currently doesn't have them in it, but you can install these. These bolts would come with your SIKKY oil pan if you're running that, or if you're running an OEM pan, it's going to have the same type of hardware, so you can put a bolt through there and a nut. All right, so the last bolt we're going to install on the DE older version of this transmission is going to be this final low profile M10 by 1.5 bolt that goes in this hole right here. Now at this point, you've got all the needed bolts in and aligned, so we're going to come back and tighten everything up, and that will complete the installation of the DE version of this adapter system, and then we'll move on to the HR version. Now, one thing to note before we move on to the HR version is there is going to be a lot of holes that aren't utilized because this adapter plate is designed to work with both the older DE style transmission as well as the newer HR or JK version of the transmission. So as long as you used up all your bolts, you did everything right, and it's normal to have a couple extra holes that aren't utilized for that exact reason. So let's move on to the HR, or the JK version of this installation. All right, so now that we're putting on the HR transmission, or JK version of this, we're gonna move the dowel pins to the upper holes and install them. And then I'm gonna spin this engine around and get the bell housing of this JK transmission right here lined up and slid onto these dowel pins, and then we'll move on to the hardware install. All right, so for the JK transmission, it's gonna come with 6 of these M12 by 175 bolts. So they're gonna go in these big holes around the top side of the bell housing here. So once you get it slid onto the dowel pins, get these bolts started and finger tight. One thing to note, we do include the dowel pins between the transmission and the plate, but oftentimes they'll still be in your transmission, so there's no need to remove the ones in your transmission if they're in there. We just provide them as a courtesy just in case they fell out or missing. All right, now we're going to take the 2 M10 by 1.5 50 millimeter long bolts and put it in these 2 holes. Once we get all these bolts in here and started, then we're going to come back and tighten them up. All right, so very similar to the DE transmission, you're going to use the 2 M8 by 125 bolts that actually go through these bottom holes in the bell housing. Now, just like the DE trans, these are threaded holes, but we're not using the threads on this side of the bell housing. These bolts simply go through the threads and thread into the plate. So, all right, so once you get that one tight, you can move on to the other side, and the same exact thing on the other side of the transmission. All right, so it's very hard to see, but on either side of this adapter plate going towards the bell housing, there's 2 countersunk holes for these low profile M10 by 1.5 bolts. So you can barely see this hole back in here, but these basically get installed in here and pass through the plate and into the bell housing. Now, depending on what kind of oil pan you're running, you may or may not be able to use these. Certain pans will cover them up. Really old SIKKY pans don't have the accommodation for this bolt hole either, but as of the design time of this adapter plate, we have added provisions to the rear pan flange going forward so you can utilize these bolts. But if you're running a different brand pan that doesn't have a back plate, then these should be wide open and able to be used. Most of these bolts, like compared to our competitors, you know, we're running more bolts through the bell housing into the adapter plate and block than most. So some of these can be considered overkill, but the more the merrier. Might as well put them in there if you got the room for it or the setup that allows it. As I said, once you get this one tight, you can move to the other side and install the other one and tighten it up. All right, so that's a wrap for the SIKKY adapter plate installation on both the DE and the JK newer style 6-speed Nissan transmission. So again, this is a universal kit. Doesn't matter what chassis you're putting it in. There are some differences between the 2 kits, so make sure you're buying it for the right transmission. If you have any questions on which one you should get or anything when you're doing the installation, you can always call or email us. And always, to find out more information about the other products we make for LS swaps or conversions to your vehicle, make sure you log on to sikky.com or get in touch with one of our knowledgeable sales reps today. Thanks.